When you think of medieval times, you're probably imagining a primitive, disconnected society with no technology or progress. But this couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, many of our modern day institutions that we take for granted originated in the medieval times, and the concept of banking is no different. And that's exactly what we're exploring in today's video. If you're new here, welcome to History Meets Finance, where we make documentaries that tell you the history and interesting stories about money. We put out new videos every single week, so please do subscribe if you haven't already. Okay, let's get back to the topic of how banking worked in medieval times. Okay, so in medieval times, society was definitely not primitive or disorganized like we usually think. In fact, this was a period defined by tremendous social and economic progress. Take banking for instance. Concepts such as bankruptcy, bills of exchange, letters of credit, and other more sophisticated forms of finance emerged in medieval times. What's more interesting is perhaps how medieval banking started in the first place. You see, looking back, there seems to be two independent developments that led to the emergence of banking. The first was the expulsion of Jewish people from Iberia because of religious intolerance. This coincidentally was happening at the same time Italy was beginning to experience tremendous economic growth, and where persecution of Jewish people were less prevalent. You see, farmers needed loans to improve their agricultural outputs, and because there was an increasing demand and growing number of buyers, they really needed some support. Also, the growing merchant class needed loans for their own longer distance trading ventures. So the Jewish people actually fulfilled this void, and they played the role of early bankers. There were two things that gave them a major advantage as financiers. The first was that they brought with them more advanced lending practices from the Middle East. You see, Europeans were simply slower to adopt these methods for their own use. And the second advantage was that unlike local Christians, they were not forbidden from charging interest. Not only did they provide high-risk loans, but they also provide other services such as underwriting, keeping accounts of transactions, and securing deposits. And as the Italian economy grew more complex, bankers progressed from being creditors to being intermediaries between two trading parties. Christian merchants themselves at this point were starting to join the practice. They started making use of loopholes, and they lessened the religious restrictions on charging interests. The process kind of went like this. A party would deposit his money against a bill, which was a written contract confirming the date and condition it must be paid to the other party. So this was a very common practice back then. Later on, this also came to include bills of exchange without any set conditions. In other words, checks or bank drafts as we know them today. So the industrious Jewish people who moved to Italy were actually helping facilitate all of this stuff. And as this took place in Italy, further north, another form of banking was emerging that involved knight orders. You see, the Crusades had resulted in a need to transfer large amounts of money across great distances. So, moving large quantities of gold and silver, especially in those times, was highly impractical. There was a high chance of being robbed and even murdered. Moreover, there was also a problem with currency conversion. In far-off lands, it would have been very difficult to find a trustworthy money exchanger capable of converting such vast amounts of money at local currencies at a fair value. These issues were resolved with knight orders, such as the Knight Templars taking the role of financiers. This made sense at the time. You see, knight orders were trusted to be credible. They had fortified holdouts scattered all over Europe, and they had the riches to make up long-distance transactions possible. So if a person wanted to move his money across a large distance, he could simply deposit his money in one of the knight order's nearest locations, and it would be transferred to another location. So this is reminiscent of what a Western Union might look like today. They would issue him a demand note. This would be used at any other branches, and they would get the same amount of money back in a local currency. This actually led to the formation of international banking at the time. Now, in both examples, with the Jewish intermediaries in Italy and with the knight orders, you can notice a similarity. Both of them address the movement of money, and both of them emerged as an outcome of religious fanaticism. It's really fascinating to see how in history, how seemingly unrelated events can cause massive changes and even spur innovation. So we've talked about how some of these banking practices originated. Now let's talk about medieval banking practices once they were a norm. So we'll look at day-to-day practices of medieval bankers. A question that might come to mind is, how did medieval bankers manage to keep reliable records of all their transactions and prevent fraud? I mean, records could be forged, people could lie, accounting errors could be made, and all sorts of other issues could play out. To prevent this, medieval bankers employed a number of various techniques, the most common of which was double record keeping. This means that each transaction would be recorded in separate accounts, debit and credit, and to ensure that it is free of error, the accounts would be balanced, which means checking if their separate sums were equal or not. And this was a pretty reliable method for medieval bankers to avoid errors. Another use was the use of chirography. This involved writing a document in 2 or 3 duplicates on the same parchment. After a transaction was agreed upon, the copies were separated with irregular cuts known as indentures, and then at a later time, the records and the indentures on the copies could be compared to ensure authenticity. Now, what about long-distance money transfers? You might be thinking that this is one area where a risk of fraud could be very high, right? Well, not really. You see, night orders were actually a very tactful method, and they were used to prevent fraud with their transactions. You see, the content of the demand notes often carried encryption that only other order members could understand. In addition, they also employed trusted couriers to send the copy to the receiving branch, which they could then use to authenticate the depositor's demand note. And if there was still suspicion, they could simply demand a confirmation letter from the issuing branch to ensure that the demand note was genuine. You see, these tactics would later be copied by more secular banking establishments that began to pop up in Europe as they began experiencing the Renaissance. In fact, these practices still apply in modern banking: encryption of information, two-way verifications, real-time confirmation via phone calls for large transactions. It's surprising to think that these practices actually originated from medieval banking systems. So you can see that the medieval banking system played a pretty critical role in shaping the foundation of today's financial systems. A lot of our practices are still medieval, only that they're done with more sophisticated technology and more sophisticated processes. What's even more fascinating is the story of bankruptcy and how that worked in medieval times. I actually made a video about bankruptcy in medieval times, so check it out here, and please do subscribe if you haven't already. It helps me out a lot. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.